Okay, hey everyone. So I'm here today with Aidan, a former colleague of mine, a good friend of mine who has lived all over the world, and he's had an experience that I haven't had in terms of he has actually lived in both Europe and Asia as an expat, originally from the UK and well, a mixture of the UK and Australia, and, not Australia, should I say, South Africa. So anyway, Aidan, so tell me, what's the main differences, would you say, between being an expat in, say, China or even Thailand, Cambodia, and being an expat in, say, Russia or where you are at the moment in Eastern Europe? What's the key differences, would you say, and which do you prefer?
Well, I always use a good rule of thumb is who makes the best cup of tea. I'm a bit of a tea junkie. China, it sounds counterintuitive, but I never got a good cup of black tea in China. Russia, brilliant tea. South Africa, brilliant tea. England, great tea. Bulgaria, where I live at the moment, tea's not bad. But it's the same going into a supermarket, as you and I discussed before. Going into a supermarket in Asia to try and buy that normal tea that we know, the closest we get is Lipton, which is frankly horrible. In South Africa, in Russia, and in Europe, you can normally pick up the brands that we know from the UK if you look hard enough. Not necessarily PG or Thai food, but you can always find Twining's English breakfast, which is always good, which is very important for me.
Okay. What were the positives and negatives for you of both living in Asia and now living in say, Bulgaria or indeed when you were in Russia? I mean, which did you prefer more overall, if you were to say?
Russia was crazy. No other words can explain it. It was a crazy place, a lovely place. I loved it. I loved the people. I lived in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Both cities are brilliant. Moscow, ridiculously expensive if you don't know where to go and find
Right.
food and drink.
But there are good deals, right?
Yeah, of course. But if you walk into a typical expat bar, you could be paying then. I mean, this was 6 years ago. I lived in Moscow. You could be paying upwards of £6 a pint of beer. Or you can walk around the corner, find a tiny little local place and pay less than £1.
Yeah.
St. Petersburg was a lot cheaper in comparison. China, again, China's crazy. I loved it. It was crazy. Again, the same I experienced in China. If you don't know where to go and you go to the typical expat bars or restaurants, you're going to be charged way more than finding a little local bar that doesn't really have many expats in. But then you have the problem of maybe they don't speak good enough English to understand what you want to order.
Yeah. Well, what did you think of the English level in say, Eastern Europe, including Russia, compared to China or other places you visited and lived in Southeast Asia?
There are far more people I found in Eastern Europe and Russia that speak a high level of English as a whole population, rather than in Asia it tends to be the people who are directly in contact with Westerners.
Yes. And returnees and people being educated overseas, wealthy people.
Yeah, it seems to be I hate to use the word lower class or working class people, but in Eastern Europe and Russia it seems that the working class and lower class seem to have a better grasp of English. I don't know, maybe it's their education system. It could be that, with all of the popular movies and popular music being predominantly in English, that tends to filter down.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. It's interesting because, of course, you now have both in private banks and indeed in numerous organisations, you've been advising expats on things like insurance and wealth management and property for a long time now. So, what's the key mistakes that you have seen? I mean, we've discussed this a few times, but what's the key mistakes you've seen expats all around the world make, but maybe in Asia slightly more than in Europe?
There are usually two mistakes that I found that people just overlook. It's not that they're making a mistake, it's just that they take things for granted, such as health insurance. Predominantly, most people go out to work as expats abroad in Asia, they're being employed by a company. they're being provided with accommodation when they first get there. They're being supplied with health insurance, life insurance, but they don't actually look into what health insurance and life insurance covers them. I mean, obviously, life insurance is pretty self-explanatory, but what level is it going to cover? Is it going to cover repatriation of your remains back to your home country, or is that going to have to be paid for by your estate or your family? Health insurance, what level of cover are you going to get? Are you going to get dental included in that? Are you going to get visits to the opticians and eye tests included in that? A lot of the time, these companies, they may be multinational, but they're purchasing an insurance product for a group. So they're going to want to get the cheapest possible quote they can. So often they slip, little things off the quoting system or off the policy itself. So you may have a policy through your company, but you may need to look into topping that up with your own policy that's going to cover you for other things that your company policy doesn't.
And of course, I guess pre-existing conditions as well, right? Because
exactly.
Even if you're in a healthcare system, like say in Singapore or Japan, you might be covered for a lot of things. If you get pre-existing conditions, if you plan to move to another country, most providers won't provide you for a cheap price, right? But if you're already covered, they often have to reinsure you, right?
Exactly. No, if you've currently got health insurance and you have a pre-existing condition that's discovered, or a condition that's discovered and then it becomes a pre-existing condition, your current insurer has the obligation to keep insuring you, providing you maintain that particular policy, i.e. renewing that policy for the next year or next 2 years or next 3 years. If you don't and you switch insurance providers, your pre-existing is then going to end up costing you far more. And if you move between a corporate and a private health insurance, that's when you end up getting large quotations coming into you.
Well, sometimes won't even insure the pre-existing condition, right? It's up to a maximum, and the maximum is pretty small.
Yes,
sometimes.
It depends on the condition, the pre-existing condition. It can be something.
If it's serious, like a heart attack, or if you're 70 and you have a heart problem, some insurers basically won't touch it, or up to
Yeah, exactly. A quick idea is if say I came across this when I was working in China for a client. He had a pre-existing condition, I should say, that high blood pressure wasn't life-threatening the way it was, except he had to take medication. Now, the insurance companies all said, yep, that's no problem, we'll have to get you tested, and you have to go through a medical check, but we will not cover you for your medication, and we will not cover you for any treatment thereof of that particular condition. Now, of course, at the beginning, you might think, oh, that's fine, I can pay for this. But then if that condition starts to get worse and you need extra treatment, you're going to have to pay for it.
Right, yeah, for sure. And what about the second, biggest mistake that you mentioned that expats tend to make?
Pensions.
Right.
And there's a number of reasons for that. It could be that they have a corporate pension sitting back in their home country, such we'll say the UK, for instance, or Ireland. They've got a corporate pension sitting there. No one's contributing into it because they've been moved abroad as an expat. That's just sitting there. It's not really making any real headway for their investment, for their pension investment pot. And if they're planning to stay outside of the UK or outside of their domicile country for a good length of time, they should seriously consider moving that either into a SIP or a QROPS, or if it's a European corporate pension, into a QNUPS. The other thing is that they may just look at what their company is currently offering them when they move out, and they're offering them a contributed pension scheme. That's great. I advise everyone to take their corporate scheme when they can as well. But what they should be looking to do is investing into their own private offshore pension as soon as they move out. Not only is that going to safeguard them for the future, it's going to make better gains in what they could possibly be making from their corporate pensions, and just leaving that to risk by saying, that's fine, I've got this pension here. It's the old adage: either you're planning to fail or you're failing to plan.
Yeah. Okay. Why are the returns sometimes better? What's the key component of that?
Remember, you have more scope of investment. You have better safeguards in
Mm.
place as well. I mean, just the other in the news a few weeks ago, there was another corporate pension scheme from the UK that has collapsed for BHS. You know, you can never trust just keeping your eggs in one basket. That's the
Sure.
important message to take away. Is
Yeah.
diversification is always the key.
And also, I think, we're from the UK, where you can have if you're from the UK, you can actually have tax-free savings if you live in the UK for an ISA. But if you live overseas, you can't do that, right?
No,
So
the
you
only
can't have
difference.
those kind of tax-free gains, right? So that's one of the other reasons why, some of these kind of offshore schemes, banking overseas and so on. But what's the easiest way of doing that? I mean, is it pretty easy to set up these kinds of schemes where people like save for like, I don't know, 5 years I mean, is it pretty easy, would you say, to set up those kinds of schemes?
They can be. The biggest hurdle that I've come across for clients is being advised, I use that term loosely, into the wrong product for them or the wrong
Mm.
length of time for that investment. Um, Ideally, no matter how old you are, in my opinion, you should not be looking for anything longer than 5 or 10 years because it gives you far more flexibility. Because,
Mm.
say, if you took a 5 year pension plan, you can then roll that straight into a secondary plan and get the benefits of putting a lump sum into it as a one-off payment and keeping the same level of investment per month for longer.
Yeah.
It's going to increase your investment pot, and in
Mm.
turn, it's going to increase the amount you have to retire on.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And one final thing, but in Cambodia, it's one of the few countries in the world now which offers, savings rates in US dollars, which are actually reasonable compared to most parts of the world. Because in most parts of the world, savings rates are close to zero, right? But in Cambodia, they're fairly high. But what would you say are some of the reasons why people shouldn't have too much money in the bank in Cambodia, even if it is in US dollars? What are the risks, would you say, are in a country like Cambodia of having too much money in the bank?
I don't think it's fair just to say Cambodia. I think, in my opinion, you should not be holding any more than 3 months' salary in your current account anywhere in the world.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
you need that buffer zone just in case. Obviously, you need direct cash there and there on the spot. So you need 3 months worth of your salary in your current account. Anything more than that, you're actually losing money on because you're not gaining anything from it. If you put it into an offshore current account, you're going to make slightly better rates of return. It's never going to set the world on fire with the rates you'll get from an offshore bank. It will be better than a high street bank. What you should be predominantly looking to do is make that money work and grow for you in the best possible way it can. Uh, whether or not you're purchasing um, funds or bonds or gilts, something of that nature, or physical gold even, or gold mining shares are very good at the moment, or swapping it between different currencies to get the best rate. Just doing something to make it work for you is always the best way. Um,
Yeah. But I think also it's a case that in Cambodia, what I was more getting at is there isn't really any government schemes there to protect people,
no,
right? In the UK, there is a maximum that the government will protect you towards. It 40 or 50,000, you'll get money back, and in fact, in the Isle of Man, in the offshore jurisdictions, you can get often up to 90% of any amount back in some certain situations. Well, not certain situations. It is the case that those kind of government schemes are put in place, right? But
yeah, I mean,
obviously, if the financial crisis ever got worse in 2009, the Cambodian government probably couldn't stand behind the system.
exactly. There's no safeguards put in for the client. And you brought up the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man works on a very good, very interesting system. It works on the same system as a model as Jersey and Guernsey, which is that
Mm.
every bank, every insurance company, every investment company has to show each year as an audit that they can afford to repay 90% of whatever is on their investment books to their clients should the worst happen.
Yeah, and that's Africa, right? There hasn't been a big banking crisis recently in those countries.
To be
Well,
honest,
not countries, dependencies, yeah.
to my knowledge, and I could be wrong, but I have never heard of a bank or investment house failing in those domiciled regions of
Right.
of Ireland, New
Okay.
Jersey, or Guernsey. Now, of course, there probably has been ones that have failed, but what I'm pointing out is I've never heard of one that's defaulted on
Doesn't happen often, yeah.
its clients'
Sure.
investments.
Absolutely, yeah. And finally, actually, one last thing, right? Some people are worried about some of the perceived risks of going into pensions or whatever. Probably because the media is always kind of hyping up a lot of the falls and gains on the market. But what's the easiest way that people can reduce their risk? Obviously, having a long-term perspective is the most obvious way, like being in the market for like 20, 30, 40 years, whatever. But what other ways can people do to reduce their risk of not losing money?
If they're using an advisor, such as myself, the best thing to do is be 100% honest and upfront with your advisor about how risk averse you are. A lot of the time, clients will get into the habit of saying what they think their advisor wants to hear, not what they feel inside that they need to do. So they need to break through that barrier. And if you're doing investments, always make sure that your financial advisor also runs through a risk assessment with you. Now that's key in my mind, because risk assessments are there deliberately done, so they'll ask the same question multiple times but in different ways to gauge your reaction to them. And
Absolutely, yeah.
it will give the best possible advice to your advisor on how much risk you want or how risk averse you are. And I always say to my clients, always err on the side of caution. Always go more adverse than you actually are.
Sure, yeah. And also, of course, monthly investing through dollar cost averaging, so that you're paying an average price and it doesn't matter if it's going down in that case.
Exactly. With the monthly, it's always, but you want the market to move up and down because you're getting that straight.
An average price.
Exactly.
For sure. Okay then, everyone. Well, that's Aidan there, so we thank him for joining us today. And if you've got any questions, I've also put a bit of a link to Aidan's contact details, and hope you all have a good day.